Welcome to Heartfelt Revenge Stories. You know that feeling when your entire world shifts beneath your feet without warning? That moment when everything you thought was solid suddenly becomes quicksand? Please subscribe and like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Because what I'm about to share with you, it's the kind of story that needs to be heard. It's real. It's raw. And honestly, it might just save someone from making the biggest mistake of their life by trusting the wrong people. 1 week after we moved into our new home, my phone rang at 9:17 p.m. The man on the line didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask how I was settling in or offer those usual pleasantries you'd expect from a stranger. He just said very quietly, "I forgot to disconnect the living room camera." My stomach didn't just drop. It fell through the floor. "Marcus," he continued, and I could hear the tension in his voice. "I'm incredibly sorry to intrude like this, truly. I was just about to delete the old security application from my phone when it pinged with a motion alert in your living room. First, I thought it might be a break-in. You know how it is, your heart jumps. But when I opened the feed, I saw something I wish I hadn't. I stood there in my kitchen, the phone pressed so hard against my ear I thought it might crack. My husband was in the living room folding boxes, that steady rhythmic sound of cardboard being packed, and my world was about to explode. "Your father and your brother," the stranger continued. "They were forging documents right there on your dining table, right where you'd been planning to host your first family dinner in this house." I couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, too heavy. I asked him, this stranger, this angel I'd never met, to save the footage. He did. Before handing over the security account, he saved everything. Every moment of betrayal. Every gesture of deception. Every word of a conspiracy I never saw coming. His name was Marcus. He'd been the previous owner of the house. A man in his late 50s who seemed so relieved to be done with this place, so eager to move forward. And now, unknowingly, he'd handed me something I didn't even realize I needed. A weapon. Proof. Working for 15 years as a border patrol supervisor had trained me for moments exactly like this. When something goes wrong, you don't panic. You don't scream. You don't let emotion run your decisions. Instead, you contain the damage. You assess the threat. And then you neutralize it. I didn't cry. I didn't demand answers from the empty air. Anger didn't come screaming through me like I'd expected it to. Instead, it came cold. Clinical. Like a ledger that wouldn't balance no matter how many times you ran the numbers. Like discovering a fundamental equation was wrong. My father, Richardson, Rich, and my younger brother, David. The people I'd silently invested in since I turned 18. The people I'd given everything to. They'd finally, irrevocably overdrawn their account of my loyalty. And tonight, I was about to file for bankruptcy on their version of family. I grabbed my keys. I left a vague note for my husband about a work emergency at the port. It was a lie, but in my line of work, you learn that truth is often stranger and more complicated than fiction. The first report is never the full picture. You wait. You investigate. You verify. I drove through the darkness toward a 24-hour diner on the edge of the city. Every mile feeling like a countdown to the moment my entire life would rearrange itself. What are they planning to do? How far does this betrayal go? Stay with me for part 2, where I meet the man who started all of this, and discover that my family's lies go deeper than I ever imagined. I met Marcus at that diner at midnight. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old regrets. Like the perfect setting for a conversation that would change everything. Industrial floor cleaner mixed with grease. It was honest somehow. Honest in a way my family had never been. Marcus looked destroyed. Like he hadn't slept in days. His hand shook, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable, as he slid a tablet across the laminate table toward me. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The video loaded with a grainy hum, and there they were. My father. 62 years old. Wearing that blue polo shirt I bought him last Christmas. His posture stiff with a false sense of authority that made my chest ache. And David. My brother. 28 years old. Lounging in my new armchair, the one I'd picked out so carefully for my first home, with this smirk on his face that I'd spent more than 2 decades funding. Every college semester. Every failed business venture. Every emergency loan. They were standing in my living room, The space where I had planned to host our first family Thanksgiving. Where I'd imagined generations gathering. My father was holding a manila folder, his hand steady in a way that made me feel physically ill. "She won't know," David said, his voice coming through the speaker so clear, so certain. "She's at the border for another 3 weeks. By the time she checks the title, the funds will be moved." My hands went numb. My father hesitated. For just a heartbeat, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt maybe. Just for a moment. But no, it was greed. Pure, unadulterated greed. $180,000 is a lot to pay back, David, he muttered, like he was thinking through a math problem, like they were discussing the weather. My brother laughed. That sharp, cutting sound that echoed through the diner, and somehow seemed to echo through every memory I had of him. "It's not a loan, Dad. It's an inheritance advance. She's strong. She'll recover. She always does." I watched my father's hand move. I watched him pick up a pen. And then I watched him trace the loops of my signature. My signature. He did it with the precision of a man who had practiced for this. He'd practiced forging my name. My father had practiced committing fraud against his own daughter. They were taking $180,000 against the equity of my home. My first home. The one I'd worked 15 years to be able to afford. They were using it to cover David's gambling debts. And David was keeping $45,000 as a broker fee for arranging the whole thing with some private lender. $45,000 for orchestrating my financial destruction. I closed the laptop. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Inside I was shaking apart, but my hands were steady. I handed the tablet back to Marcus and thanked him. I meant it with every fiber of my being. I didn't feel broken. I felt sharpened. Like all those years of showing up, of being strong, of being the reliable one, had been leading to this moment. My compassion for them, that luxury they'd exploited for years, was being put on a payment plan, and tonight I was filing for bankruptcy on their version of family. This wasn't going to be revenge. That would be too emotional, too messy. This was going to be accounting. Cold. Clean. Factual. I sat in my car in the dark parking lot, my laptop glowing in the darkness. I didn't call them. I didn't send an angry text. No drama. No confrontation. Instead, I logged into our shared bank accounts and changed every password. I revoked my father's access to my emergency power of attorney. I placed a fraud alert on my credit. I flagged the pending mortgage application with a breach of security notice. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were only going to be shocked that I'd stopped playing along. By the time the sun started to rise over the harbor, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise. The kind made of facts, numbers, and the quiet sound of a woman taking her life back. But this was just the beginning. In part 3, I discover that the financial betrayal is only half the story. They didn't just steal my money. They stole my identity. And they dragged me to the edge of a federal prison in the process. I walked through the empty rooms of my new house the next morning. The floorboards echoed with a hollow sound that matched the space in my chest. For 32 years I had been the reliable one. The daughter whose accomplishments were only celebrated because they provided a safety net for everyone else. The sister who never said no. Now, I realized something that broke me open in a different way. My role hadn't been a daughter or a sister. It was a resource. They'd been strip mining me for decades, pulling out everything valuable and leaving me hollowed out. I remember being 10 years old. David was 6. I'd saved my allowance for months to buy this incredible specialized science kit. I wanted it so badly. I was obsessed with it. Finally, I brought it home, so proud of myself, so excited to learn. David threw a tantrum because he wanted a new video game instead. My father didn't tell him to wait. He didn't explain that I'd earned this. He just took my science kit back to the store and used the refund to buy David's game. I can still see him looking at me with that practiced smile, the one I'd see 1,000 more times over the years. "You're smart, Marcus," he said. Wait, no, that was my father's name in the diary. I was the smart one. "Marcus, you don't need a kit to be successful. David needs the win. Family helps family." That became the policy. My strength was never mine. It was an asset to be distributed among the weaker members of the family. When I joined the Border Patrol, my father's emergencies began. Medical bills that insurance supposedly didn't cover. Property taxes that were suddenly due. I never asked for the money back. I thought I was buying love. I thought if I just gave enough, they'd finally see me. They'd finally value me. But I was just paying rent on a relationship that should have been free. I called Julia, an attorney who specialized in cases like this. Someone who understood that blood isn't thicker than water. It's just a biological excuse people use when they want to justify theft. We met in a glass-walled office overlooking the historic district. Julia didn't offer me platitudes or pity. She offered me evidence, and that's what I needed. The signatures on the mortgage are forged, Marcus, she said, sliding a folder across her desk. My stomach dropped again. They didn't go through a traditional bank. That would have taken months of verification. Instead, they targeted a predatory private lender. A hard money firm that specializes in high-interest bridge loans. These lenders only care about collateral. She pulled out more documents. They promised a 14-day payout because they had your house as collateral and a forged signature from a federal agent to greenlight the risk. They thought that badge would make you look legitimate. But Julia wasn't finished. Her voice dropped lower, and I could hear something shift in her tone. Something darker. But they didn't just stop at the house, she continued. My investigators found a second filing. David used your name to secure another high-interest private loan. This time using your mother's heritage jewelry as collateral. The emerald earrings. The gold necklace she wore on her wedding day. He's already pocketed $45,000 of that as a management fee. I rubbed my eyes trying to find some feeling I could name. Anger? Betrayal? But there was only clarity. Crystalline, perfect clarity. They've turned your entire life into a liquidation sale, Julia said quietly. They're not just stealing from you. They're commodifying you. This wasn't a family crisis. This was hostile. This was deliberate. This was someone looking at the person they were supposed to protect and seeing inventory to liquidate. Julia drafted a formal notice, and we decided exactly where to serve it. Not at my father's house where he could cry and beg and perform his way out of it. No. Neutral ground. A place with official records. A place with cameras everywhere. I sent a text to the family group chat. Meeting at the municipal building Thursday at 10 a.m. to finalize the paperwork. Be there if you want the money. My father hearted the message within seconds. Seconds. Like he was already tasting the money. Like his daughter's financial future was just another transaction he could cash in. David followed with, "About time, sis." The night before that meeting, Julia called me back to her office. And what she told me made the previous betrayals look like practice. What she revealed was going to change everything. Tune in to part 4, where I discover that my family didn't just steal from me. They used my name, my identity, my entire professional reputation as a tool for money laundering. And I was one audit away from federal prison. Julia called me back to her office the day before the meeting. When I walked in, she didn't look like an attorney anymore. She looked like someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "It's worse than the jewelry and the house," she said. And her voice had dropped into that frequency reserved for news that permanently changes your life. "Marcus, sit down." I sat. "David broke into your home office. He stole copies of your sensitive financial records, personal identity information, the kind of documentation you use to maintain your federal security clearance." The room started to spin. "He didn't just steal money," Julia continued, each word hitting like a punch. "He hijacked your professional reputation." I couldn't process what she was saying. "He used your credentials," she went on, "to vouch for his shady transactions. He tricked the monitoring systems into thinking this was legitimate income from a government employee. Marcus, your name was the validation he used to move dirty money." I felt the walls pressing in. Julia pulled out another set of documents. He established a shell company called Harbor Crown Logistics. And guess who he listed as the sole owner and chief executive officer? Me. It was me. Your digital signature has been forged on documents that authorize the movement of nearly $300,000 over the last 6 months. It wasn't just gambling debt anymore. Your brother was laundering money for a private lending group to clear his losses. And because your name is on the charter, because your federal credentials are stamped all over these transactions, you are the one the government is going to come for when the audit hits. The words didn't make sense. They were English words, but they didn't connect to any reality I understood. You're the one who will be led away in handcuffs, Julia said softly. While David enjoys his $45,000 fee, you could be facing 20 years in federal prison. I stared at the incorporation papers. My hands were shaking now. Not cold and clinical anymore. Just shaking. There it was. My father's signature. Not just on the mortgage. Not just on the jewelry loan. On the paperwork that made me complicit in money laundering. Jonathan hadn't just turned a blind eye to David's greed. He had actively participated in a scheme that could land his own daughter in a federal penitentiary for 2 decades. He knew the risks. He understood my job required a clean record. Federal employment meant background checks and security clearances and a reputation that couldn't be questioned. Yet he had signed that paper anyway. He had effectively offered my freedom as a sacrifice to keep his favorite son from facing the consequences of his own choices. This was the lethal discovery. This was the moment the bridge wasn't just burned. It was atomized. Obliterated. You don't negotiate with people who are willing to trade your life for their comfort. You don't send them a disappointing text message. You don't give them a second chance. They hadn't just overdrafted my bank account. They had targeted my future and pulled the trigger. They had transformed our biological bond into a death warrant. I looked at Julia and told her to loop in the federal investigators I knew at the bureau. The ones who trusted me. The ones who knew my reputation was clean. If they want a federal case, I said, my voice steady again, that clinical precision returning, I'm going to give them one. I was going to protect myself the only way I could. By making sure they couldn't hide behind the word family anymore. The sting was being set. The trap was being built. And they had no idea what was coming. In part 5, I walk into that municipal building wearing a wire. My father and brother think they're walking into a meeting to collect money. Instead, they're walking into federal handcuffs and the consequences of a lifetime of exploitation. This is where I take my power back. This is where it ends. The municipal building was a maze of gray hallways, and the sharp smell of industrial floor wax. A sterile environment. A perfect environment for the clinical precision of what was about to happen. I arrived early, flanked by Julia. The federal agents weren't sitting in the room with us. They were in a black SUV parked down the street, headsets on, monitoring every word through the wire I was wearing against my skin. My heartbeat was the steady rhythm of a woman about to explode her entire family into federal prosecution. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a sting operation. And I wasn't here as a daughter anymore. I was the bait in a federal trap. My pulse was exactly 60 beats per minute. Clinical. Professional. The way I'd been trained. Jonathan and David walked in 5 minutes late. David was wearing a designer shirt that probably cost $600. Likely purchased with the management fee he'd stolen from my mother's heritage. He looked smug, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who thought he was minutes away from a windfall. My father followed, adjusting his tie, trying to project the image of the protective patriarch. He had the audacity to smile at me. "Glad we could settle this, Marcus," he said, his voice warm with that practiced sincerity I'd believed my entire life. Family should always handle things internally. I didn't smile back. I looked at Julia, and she placed a tablet in the center of the table. She hit play. The footage from the living room filled the room. The audio was crisp. Perfect. They watched themselves on that screen. They heard David laugh about me always being on base. They saw my father's steady hand forge my signature. They heard every word of conspiracy. Every joke. Every casual mention of my future being liquidated for their comfort. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush lungs. Jonathan's face went from flushed and greedy to a sickly ashen gray. Like watching someone realize they've made a decision that can't be unmade. David's bravado drained instantly. His foot started this frantic, nervous tap under the table. Tap, 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 tap. The sound of a man's world falling apart in real time. "You were spying on us?" Jonathan whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. I looked at him with the same detachment I used for scanning suspicious shipping manifests. Cold. Professional. Unattached. "I wasn't spying," I replied, my voice calm and factual and lethal. "I was securing my property. You were the ones who decided to perform a crime in my living room. And then, I'll never forget this moment, the mask of the patriarch disintegrated. My father didn't just slump in his chair. He slid out of it until he was kneeling on the linoleum floor. Kneeling. Like he was begging for forgiveness from a god he'd stopped believing in years ago. "Marcus, please," he begged. His eyes wet with tears that felt like a performance even now. Even at the end. "Think of the family name. Think of our honor. We'll pay it back. Don't destroy your brother over a mistake. He's all I have left." And looking at him quivering on that floor, I realized the absolute truth of his existence. This was power that came from an empty wallet. This was the illusion of authority built entirely on my money. For my entire adult life, Jonathan had acted like the pillar of the family. But that position had been a luxury he'd been renting with my resources. He wasn't a leader. He was a tenant in a life he couldn't afford without me. Without my resources to prop up his ego, he wasn't a father. He was just an accomplice to fraud. A man who loved money more than he loved his daughter's freedom. David didn't beg. He snapped. His face contorted with feral rage. The mask cracked, and the real person underneath came spilling out. "You think you're so much better than us because of that badge?" He spat, his voice full of venom. "You're a traitor to your own blood." I didn't flinch. I didn't feel hurt or shocked or betrayed anymore. I'd already said goodbye to those feelings. I pushed a manila folder across the table toward them. Inside was a federal summons for money laundering. A notice of immediate seizure for the assets David had hidden in Harbor Crown Logistics. All of it. Everything. "I already did something for the family," I said, my tone as cold as a winter morning. As final as a closing door. "I stopped the rot. The rest is in the hands of the United States Attorney." I stood up and walked toward the door. The sound of my father's sobbing was just background noise. Just static. Just the sound of a man realizing too late that he'd destroyed the only person who'd ever actually had his back. They weren't shocked by their betrayal. They were only shocked that I'd finally stopped footing the bill for it. The legal battle ended decisively. The unauthorized $180,000 mortgage was officially voided. The heritage jewelry, those emerald earrings, that gold necklace my mother had worn on her wedding day, was returned to its rightful place in my safe. David and Jonathan didn't end up in orange jumpsuits, but their names were permanently added to a federal registry for financial fraud. Their reputations in our city were effectively liquidated, destroyed beyond repair. Tyler was forced to pay back every cent of the $45,000 he'd pocketed as a management fee, a debt that would take him a lifetime to clear. I stood on the balcony of my house overlooking the harbor, the early morning sun painting the water in shades of bruised purple and gold. The salt air felt different now. It wasn't heavy with the humidity of a buried secret anymore. It was light with the clarity of a fresh start. For 32 years I had been the reliable daughter. The one who apologized for her own success so that others wouldn't feel small. The sister who never said no. The person who turned compassion into a full-time job serving people who didn't deserve it. But that version of me died in that windowless conference room. I realized then that letting go of blood ties wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. It was self-defense. DNA is just a blueprint. But family is a contract. A contract of mutual respect and protection. When they forged my signature, when they hijacked my identity, when they offered my freedom as a sacrifice for their comfort, they breached that contract permanently. Cutting them out was like finally removing a piece of shrapnel I'd been carrying since childhood. The initial pull was painful. It hurt in ways I didn't know pain could hurt. But the relief that followed was absolute. Complete. Like breathing air after spending your whole life underwater. With Julia's help, I used the restitution funds to establish the Lawson Legal Defense Fund. It's a foundation dedicated to providing pro bono legal counsel to service members whose finances are compromised while they're on deployment or stationed away from home. People like me. People who show up. People who are strong. People who deserve better. I didn't want my story to end with just a closed bank account. I wanted to build something that would protect the next person who was always away and unable to see the betrayal happening in their own living room. This house is finally quiet. The floorboards still creak and the fresh paint still lingers in the air. But the ghosts are gone. The weight has lifted. I don't need a hidden camera to watch my back anymore, because I finally learned how to defend my own boundaries. I am no longer a line item on someone else's balance sheet. I am no longer the reliable daughter, the walking ATM, the person whose success was just an investment vehicle for everyone else's failure. I am a woman who found her worth not in their approval, but in her own truth. Tell me in the comments, which part of this story hit hardest for you? And if you've dealt with something similar. If someone you loved betrayed your trust, if family became a four-letter word, if you had to choose between loyalty and self-preservation, share your story. You're not alone. None of us are carrying these battles alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Because there are so many of us out there who needed to hear this. Who needed to know that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. That sometimes protection means saying no. That sometimes family is the people who choose you, not the people who are supposed to. We have many more stories to share. Stories that are real. Stories that are human. Stories that are hard. Stories that might just change someone's life tonight. So keep walking this path with us. Subscribe, listen, and know that every time you share your truth, you're giving someone else permission to find theirs. Let's keep going together.